I recently came across a clip from a gathering called NatalCon. It was a room full of people, venture capitalists, tech influencers, and political strategists, all huddled together talking about demographic collapse with the kind of intensity usually reserved for a meteor heading toward Earth. They weren't just worried, they were obsessed. They spoke about childless cat ladies and the end of Western civilization, as if the declining number of strollers on the sidewalk was a personal affront to the future. On paper, their solution is simple: just pay people. And some governments are doing exactly that. Take Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban has essentially turned the national treasury into a giant baby-making incentive. If you're a mother of 4 there, you effectively never pay income tax again. You get subsidized housing, cheap loans, and direct cash. It sounds like a pro-family utopia. But if you walk through the residential districts of Budapest, you don't see a sudden explosion of toddlers. Instead, you find couples who took the government's money, bought the apartment, and then realized that no amount of tax exemptions could buy back the time, the sleep, or the career trajectory they'd have to sacrifice for a 3rd or 4th child. The baby bonus didn't change their desires. It just subsidized a decision they were already struggling to make. This is the great paradox of the modern era. From the high-tech boardrooms of Silicon Valley to the pristine, socialized nurseries of Scandinavia, the world's most powerful entities are throwing billions of dollars at the cradle. They've tried free IVF, flexicurity labor laws, and aggressive nationalist rhetoric. Yet across the board, the numbers continue to slide. It's as if we're watching a massive, expensive experiment in social engineering fail in real time, leaving the experts baffled. It raises a question that most leaders are too terrified to voice. What if this isn't a policy failure at all? What if the population collapse isn't a temporary glitch we can fix with a bigger check, but the inevitable final stage of the world we've spent the last century building? We spent decades fearing we'd have too many people. Now we're realizing we might have finally reached peak people, and no amount of money can turn the tide back.
I mean, that is just, it's the terrifying, unvarnished premise we're doing a deep dive into today. We're taking all this demographic data, the evolutionary biology models, macroeconomic forecasts, and really trying to dissect whether this global fertility crash is, a terminal disease for human civilization or simply a radical, unavoidable phase of our own evolution.
Right. Because if you're listening to this right now, just look at the physical environment around you, the architecture, the transit systems, the intense economic demands placed on your time. We have to start by completely discarding the high-level macroeconomic policies and looking directly at the lived sensory reality of the modern city.
Exactly. You have to look at the ground level.
Yeah. So to do that, we need a journey to the extreme edge of this phenomenon. Consider the daily life of Hannah. She's a 35-year-old urban planner living right in the heart of Seoul, South Korea. And her entire 20s were defined by this frantic, just unrelenting sprint. Not just, a desire to succeed, but a mandatory bruising gauntlet to accumulate educational and professional credentials.
And that sprint isn't driven by some unchecked, greedy ambition. It's literally the baseline requirement to survive in an environment where the cost of a single square meter of real estate in a district like, say, Gangnam feels akin to a ransom note.
A ransom note, exactly.
Yeah, Hannah's daily existence isn't an abstract data point on some demographer's chart. It's defined by an inescapable sensory reality. I mean, imagine the jarring fluorescent lights of her regular 11 o'clock at night subway commute home.
Oh, wow. 11 at night.
Right. Her ears are constantly ringing with the vibrating mechanical hum of a metropolis that just never powers down. And then, contrast that chaotic neon-lit exhaustion with the quiet, sterile, intensely clinical atmosphere of her scheduled egg freezing appointments.
Let's focus on that contrast for a second, because for someone like Hannah, delaying marriage and childbearing is absolutely not a rebellious ideological choice. She's not reading feminist literature and deciding to strike against the patriarchy by withholding children.
No.
She is making the only logical, deeply rational response to an economic landscape that demands 14-hour workdays simply for the privilege of paying rent. What she experiences is a profound state of structural fatigue.
Structural fatigue, that is the exact right term for it. The biological clock that, millions of years of evolutionary history embedded within her cellular structure, it's completely drowned out by the mechanical, demanding rhythm metropolis.
Yeah.
When political strategists at a conference speak of a, quote, demographic collapse, they're speaking a language that has absolutely zero resonance with her immediate suffocating reality. She doesn't wake up feeling like a data point in a civilizational crisis.
Right. She wakes up as a physically exhausted person just trying to keep her head above water in a world that is structurally, physically, and economically completely hostile to the presence of strollers.
Exactly.
I actually want to introduce an analogy here to explain the exact mechanism of what's happening to Hannah and, well, millions of people just like her. It's something I call the biological pressure cooker. Yeah, so if you think about how a pressure cooker actually works, it seals a chamber, traps all the energy inside, and relentlessly cranks up the heat and pressure to drastically accelerate the cooking process. A modern hypercity like Seoul or Tokyo or New York, it functions exactly like that.
Right, it traps the energy.
We have intentionally engineered these environments to trap human capital, our education, our time, our ambition, and subject it to massive economic pressure to extract absolute maximum GDP output. But the deep irony of this, triumph of capitalism is that biology cannot survive in a pressure cooker.
No, it really can't.
Biology, human reproduction, requires a slow simmer. It requires slack in the system. Time to heal, time to sleep, time to bond. If you make a biological organism and subject it to peak economic pressure, it doesn't thrive. It completely shuts down its non-essential functions to survive.
Yeah.
The urge to reproduce is just cooked out of the population.
Yeah.
We've built spectacular machines for generating wealth, and in doing so, we've built environments entirely toxic to biological reproduction.
And, that structural reality completely dismantles a very persistent myth that gets repeated in political circles all the time. There's this entrenched narrative that women's expanding career ambitions are the primary isolated cause of falling birth rates.
Oh, I've heard that a million times.
Right. The assumption dictates that as women become wealthier, more educated, gain access to the boardroom, they simply and selfishly prioritize careers over having children. But the data reveals a vastly more complex and, frankly, counterintuitive reality.
Yeah.
If you look at the demographic trends spanning the entire 20th century, you observe a distinct, undeniable convergence of fertility rates among both rich and poor women.
Wait. I need to stop you there and push back a little. Because if we look at the history of the last 50 years, the feminist movement and the mass entry of women into the higher echelons of the workforce completely revolutionized society. Are you saying that monumental shift in ambition and opportunity didn't cause the drop in birth rates? I mean, it seems completely intuitive that a woman running a division at a tech company has less time and desire to have 4 children than a stay-at-home mother in the 1950s.
It is intuitive, yeah, but it's statistically incomplete. The decline in fertility isn't a simple linear result of women entering the boardroom. Let's look at the current data in the United States, which complicates this ambition narrative entirely. Right now, college-educated women and higher-income women actually often have slightly more children than their lower-income counterparts.
Really, let that sink in for a second. The women with the most demanding, ambitious careers are beginning to outproduce women in lower-wage, less secure jobs. I mean, if higher-income women are having slightly more children, it proves that having a family is basically transitioned into a luxury good.
It's a luxury.
It requires a baseline level of financial stability, housing security, and healthcare access that is increasingly just out of reach for the average worker. A wealthy tech executive can afford the nanny, the larger house, the fertility treatments. The barista working 2 jobs cannot.
And this leads directly to a staggering paradox in public policy. We are currently looking at falling birth rates and labeling it an existential crisis. But a massive, undeniable portion of that decline is driven by something every modern society universally celebrates as a monumental triumph.
You're talking about the eradication of teenage and unintended pregnancies, right?
Yes. For decades, governments, healthcare providers, educators, they poured billions of dollars into massive public health campaigns to reduce early unintended births. They revolutionized access to contraception, implemented comprehensive sex education, shifted the social norms surrounding teen pregnancy.
Which is obviously a huge win.
Right. It's widely and correctly regarded as one of the greatest public policy successes of the modern era. It drastically improved the health, educational outcomes, and lifetime economic prospects of millions of young women.
But the inescapable mathematical consequence of preventing those unintended pregnancies is, well, a dramatically lower overall national birth rate.
Exactly. We are now watching these exact same societies express intense existential alarm that their fertility is too low, while completely ignoring the fact that a massive chunk of that low rate is the direct intentional result of policies they actively championed and executed.
It's the ultimate case of being careful what you wish for. We gave people absolute control over their reproduction, and they were using that control exactly as one would expect to adapt to the economic pressure cooker we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
They're choosing survival over reproduction.
Yeah.
But this also points to a fundamental shift in the very definition of what a child is. I mean, a child in 1920 meant something entirely different to a household than a child in 2024.
Absolutely. That is the transition from the first demographic transition involving a complete historical inversion of the quantity-quality trade-off. Let's look at a traditional agrarian society a century ago. Children were fundamentally economic assets.
Right.
From a very young age, a child could pick crops, tend animals, provide essential manual labor on the family farm. Furthermore, they served as the only available form of social security for their parents in old age. In that environment, a large family wasn't some romantic ideal. It was a harsh economic necessity.
But as soon as we move people off the farms and into hyper-urban environments, that equation shatters. In modern urban economies, children instantly transition from being economic assets who generate value to becoming massive, decades-long emotional and financial liabilities.
Exactly. And this shift is deeply intertwined with a sociological concept known as developmental idealism. As a society urbanizes, modernizes, and builds welfare states, there's a natural, unavoidable progression toward later marriage and significantly lower infant mortality rate.
Which changes everything.
Because when parents no longer have to endure the tragedy of losing half their children to disease, their behavior changes. They don't have 6 children with the grim hope that 3 might survive to work the land. Instead, they have 1 or 2 children, and they redirect all of their available resources into a dramatic increase in the per capita investment in those specific children.
Right. They invest immense capital into their education, their healthcare, their psychological well-being, their extracurriculars.
The entire societal focus shifts completely from the quantity of the family size to the individual quality and competitive advantage of the child.
Which brings us directly to the great experiment happening in Eastern Europe right now, and why this entire framework makes the situation in Budapest so intensely fascinating. We need to leave the pressure cooker of Seoul and walk into the residential districts of Hungary to meet Zsofia.
Zsofia's case is incredible.
If you just look at Zsofia on a government spreadsheet, she represents the absolute ultimate success story of state-led pronatalism. She lives in a spacious, newly renovated modern apartment that was almost entirely funded by the Hungarian government's CSO housing subsidy.
Yep.
The government identified a problem: low birth rates. They offered a massive financial incentive to solve it, and Zsofia took the deal. But the physical space she occupies is laced with an incredible, terrifying underlying psychological tension. When you actually speak to her, you realize she lives in a constant state of quiet, simmering anxiety.
Because the state has essentially transformed her biology into a financial contract.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She is currently on her 3rd pregnancy, but she doesn't describe this impending child as a romantic fulfillment of her deep family dreams. She describes the child literally as a debt repayment to the state. The financial strings attached to these massive Hungarian subsidies are incredibly strict and unforgiving. If Zsofia fails to produce the mandated number of children within the stipulated time frame, whether due to biological infertility, marital breakdown, or simply, changing her mind, the heavily subsidized interest rates on her housing loan will immediately skyrocket to punitive market rates. It threatens her entire family with absolute bankruptcy.
So she's trapped.
Completely. The state broadcasts heavy, aggressive nationalist rhetoric celebrating the sanctity of the traditional family, but Zsofia's daily reality is profoundly different. Her reality involves taking her 2 existing children to local pediatric clinics that are chronically underfunded, severely understaffed, and physically crumbling. She expressed this intense, claustrophobic feeling of being a breeding vessel trapped in a gilded cage.
It's stark proof that a genuine desire for life cannot be legislated. And it certainly can't be bought when the underlying sense of security is entirely manufactured, fragile, and frankly, deeply conditional. Zsofia's experience exposes the fundamental, devastating flaw in relying on financial incentives to engineer complex demographic outcomes. The state is attempting to treat a deeply personal, structural, biological decision as a simple transactional equation. You give me a baby, I give you a house. And this requires us to look very closely and very critically at the actual data these governments use to loudly proclaim their success on the global stage.
Let's look at that data.
Hungarian policymakers frequently and proudly point to their total fertility rate, or TFR. It increased from a record low of 1.25 in 2010 to a much healthier-looking 1.59 in 2021.
Right.
They present this specific metric to the world as undeniable mathematical proof that allocating an astounding 6% of their gross domestic product to family policies is actively working. However, this entire narrative relies on a profound structural demographic deception.
Wait, I have to push back here. I have to argue the other side for a minute. Look at the sheer math of what Orban is doing. He's throwing 6% of Hungary's total economic output at this problem. We just established that for Hannah in Seoul, the barrier was that everything is too expensive and the environment is structurally hostile.
Sure.
If money and housing were the barriers, then throwing essentially unlimited free money, totally subsidized housing, and lifetime income tax exemptions at Sofia should absolutely solve the problem.
Okay.
I mean, if money was the barrier, money should be the cure. How can you possibly argue that a measurable rise from 1.25 to 1.59 is an illusion? The policy seems to be doing exactly what it was designed to do.
To understand why the massive capital injection fails to alter the long-term trajectory, we have to unpack a critical demographic concept. We need to dissect the difference between the tempo of fertility and the quantum of fertility.
Okay.
Think of it like a calendar versus a final tally. The standard total fertility rate, the number politicians love to quote, is highly aggressively sensitive to the timing of births. This is what demographers call tempo. If a large cohort of women simultaneously decide to delay having children, perhaps because they want to pursue higher education, or because they're navigating a severe national economic crisis, the standard TFR will drop sharply and terrifyingly in that specific year.
Okay.
But here is the crucial part. It drops even if those exact same women still fully plan to have the exact same number of children eventually. They haven't changed their final number, they have simply changed the calendar date.
So they're just postponing.
Yes. Conversely, if those women later decide to have those delayed children all at once, or decide to have their planned children earlier than they previously intended, the standard TFR will artificially and massively spike. This creates a statistical illusion of a baby boom. This is where the groundbreaking work of demographers Bongartz and Feeney becomes absolutely essential. They developed a much more sophisticated metric called the tempo and parity-adjusted total fertility rate. It's known as TFRP. Let me explain this mechanism clearly. Imagine TFRP as a highly advanced filter.
Okay.
It mathematically strips away all the statistical noise and distortions caused by shifts in the timing of births. It looks past the calendar changes to reveal the true underlying quantum of fertility. The quantum is the actual, finalized, completed family size. How many children did these women ultimately have by the end of their reproductive years?
Okay, so if we apply this TFRP filter to the Hungarian data, if we strip away the calendar shifting, what does it actually reveal about Orban's miracle?
It reveals that the miracle is a complete mirage line. That dramatic, terrifying dip to a 1.25 TFR in 2010 was not a sudden collective loss of desire for children among Hungarian women. It was driven directly by a spiraling, catastrophic national debt crisis following the 2008 financial crash, which caused severe economic uncertainty.
Right. Couples responded entirely rationally.
Exactly. They postponed their planned pregnancies, they pushed the calendar back. Then, as the economy gradually stabilized over the next decade and the government introduced these massive, incredibly lucrative housing subsidies, couples suddenly felt secure enough to bring forward the children they had already planned to have anyway.
Wow. So the subsequent rise to 1.59 wasn't a true increase in the quantum of fertility at all. It wasn't women deciding to have a third or fourth child they didn't previously want. It was merely a slowdown and postponement.
Exactly. Couples were actively pulling births forward on the calendar to take immediate advantage of the financial subsidies before the political winds shifted or the rules changed. They were cashing in. When you examine the TFRP metric for Hungary over this entire decade-long period, stripping away the tempo distortions, it hovered stubbornly, immovably around 1.5 to 1.6. The actual completed family size did not change by a single fraction. The state, despite spending billions of dollars, did not convince women to have a third or fourth child they didn't already desire. It merely subsidized the exact timing of the first and second children they were already going to have.
That is a staggering realization. The government policy is essentially just paying people massive amounts of money to do what they were going to do anyway, just on a slightly accelerated timeline. They aren't creating new humans, they're just rescheduling them.
Rescheduling them, exactly.
And if we step back and look at the hard, unforgiving math of absolute numbers, the picture becomes incredibly dire. Because of a rapidly shrinking cohort of reproductive age women, a structural deficit caused by previous decades of low birth rates and massive outmigration of young people to Western Europe, The absolute number of live births in Hungary has completely, totally stagnated. Listen to these numbers. They had 90,000 live births in 2010. By 2020, despite dedicating 6% of their GDP to this issue, despite the loans, despite the tax exemptions, they only had 92,000 births.
Barely moved the needle.
To just replace expected deaths and keep the population completely stable without relying on immigration, Hungary mathematically requires roughly 127,000 births annually. So even with the most aggressive, most well-funded, most radically pro-natalist policies on the face of the earth, they are still operating at a massive 40% deficit.
Yep.
The policies are doing nothing more than subsidizing middle-class lifestyle choices, paying for Sophia's nice apartment, without altering the fundamental demographic trajectories by a single inch.
Which brings us to a profound, often deeply uncomfortable, and entirely overlooked consequence of these long-term demographic trajectories. When a society fails to alter its birth rates through social engineering or financial policy, and when it remains firmly locked in a sub-replacement fertility state for multiple generations, the implications extend far beyond economics and housing markets. We are beginning to transition from the observable fail engineering to the hidden, microscopic underlying biological consequences.
Right, and this is where the data gets genuinely mind-bending. Because if policy cannot fix this, we have to pose a theoretical scenario that pushes the absolute boundaries of how we think about human evolution and biology. If you're listening to this, think about your own lineage. For thousands of years, your ancestors had to be highly fertile just to survive.
Yeah.
But if we now live in a society for generations where having children is entirely optional, where the intense pressure to reproduce is heavily mitigated by highly effective contraception and rapidly changing social norms, and where environmental factors are shifting radically, does our actual fundamental biological capacity to reproduce begin to degrade? Are we losing the physical ability to have children because we're no longer exercising the evolutionary muscle?
It is a vital revolutionary question, and it's grounded in the strict mechanics of evolutionary biology through a concept known as the relaxed selection hypothesis. Let's look at the brutal reality of human history. For millennia, human populations were subjected to immense, unforgiving selection pressure. High infant mortality, rampant infectious disease, famine, and harsh environmental conditions dictated a cruel math. Couples needed the fundamental biological capacity, the natural fecundity, to conceive and successfully deliver 5 to 7 children just to ensure that 2 survived to adulthood to replace them.
That's a brutal reality.
The genotype for high fertility was ruthlessly selected for by nature because any genetic predisposition toward subfertility meant that a specific genetic lineage would simply die out. It was eradicated from the gene pool. However, in modern post-transition societies, that intense Darwinian selection pressure has been entirely eradicated. The Malthusian constraints are gone.
Right.
Today, high-fertility genotypes offer absolutely zero evolutionary advantage when couples voluntarily utilize modern contraception to strictly limit their family size to 1 or 0. Nature is no longer actively testing or selecting for robust reproductive health.
So, because we aren't constantly pushing our reproductive limits against a hostile environment, the specific genetic traits that made our ancestors highly fertile are essentially drifting. We're losing the genetic edge. But it's not just passive genetic drift, is it? We are actively medically intervening in the human reproductive process in ways that might be radically exacerbating this exact biological degradation.
Exactly. This leads us directly to the assisted reproductive technology, or RT paradox. The medical miracles of in vitro fertilization and intracytoplasmic sperm injection, commonly known as ICSI, have undeniably brought immense joy to millions of families. They are marvels of modern medicine, but from a strict cold population genetics perspective, they may inadvertently be weakening fundamental human fecundity over successive generations.
Okay.
ICSI is the most critical procedure to examine here. Let me explain the mechanics of how it works and why it alters our evolutionary trajectory. In a natural conception scenario, a severe genetic infertility issue in a male, such as a Y chromosome microdeletion or a specific mutation known as an AZFC mutation, would render that man completely sterile.
Right.
From a ruthless evolutionary standpoint, that specific genetic mutation would be abruptly, permanently eliminated from the human gene pool. It's a harsh biological reality for the individual, but it systematically maintains the overall reproductive fitness of the larger population.
Oh, what?
However, the ICSI procedure bypasses this natural selection process entirely. By using a microscopic needle to mechanically inject a single struggling sperm directly into an egg, medical science allows men with severe genetic infertility to successfully conceive.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand the exact mechanism here. If a man has a genetic mutation on his Y chromosome that makes him infertile, and a doctor uses a needle to force that sperm into an egg to create a male child, that male child receives his father's Y chromosome, which means those exact genetic mutations causing the severe infertility are being directly passed on to the son.
Because these specific mutations are located exclusively on the Y chromosome, they are vertically transmitted directly from father to son with 100% certainty. By utilizing advanced medical technology, we are actively artificially retaining subfertile genotypes within the human population that nature would have discarded.
Wow.
The son will inherit the exact same severe fertility issues as the father. When that son grows up and wishes to have a child, he will subsequently require the exact same intensive, expensive art medical interventions to conceive the next generation. We are actively creating a biological genetic dependency on medical technology to sustain human population numbers.
It is a stunning, terrifying cycle. We are essentially taking genetic traits that make it hard to have babies and guaranteeing they are passed to the next generation, ensuring that those kids will also need doctors and microscopes to reproduce. And that growing biological dependency is compounding with what we are simultaneously doing to the physical environment. We cannot talk about human reproductive biology without talking about the physical environments we inhabit. We discuss the urban economy as a metaphorical pressure cooker, but the literal physical urban environment is increasingly toxic to our germlines.
The environmental impact on reproductive biology is severe, measurable, and rapidly accelerating. Modern urban environments expose entire populations to a constant, inescapable barrage of endocrine-disrupting chemicals.
Specifically,
These include bisphenols, which are ubiquitously found in rigid plastics and the resin linings of canned foods, and phthalates, which are chemical compounds used to increase the flexibility of plastics in everything from food packaging to shampoos and personal care products.
they're everywhere.
Everywhere. Furthermore, the inescapable presence of nanoplastics in our bloodstreams and high levels of particulate air pollution in our cities are inducing massive amounts of what biologists call oxidative stress. This oxidative stress causes direct physical DNA damage in both the male and female germlines.
Let's break down oxidative stress. What does that actually mean for the population at large? How does this invisible chemical bombardment physically manifest in humanity?
It physically manifests as severe secular declines in sperm counts across the entire globe and an increasing mutational load being passed to offspring. This oxidative stress literally damages the physical integrity of the DNA within the sperm and the egg. When you combine all these factors, the relaxed selection hypothesis removing evolutionary pressure, the vertical transmission of genetic subfertility via medical technology like ICSI, and the constant daily environmental bombardment of endocrine-disrupting chemicals, you create a vortex that evolutionary biologists are beginning to recognize as the post-transition fecundity trap.
The fecundity trap.
Yes. The trap operates with brutal efficiency. The longer a society remains in a low fertility environment, relying on medical interventions to compensate for declining natural fecundity, while simultaneously delaying childbearing to later, more biologically precarious ages, the poorer its fundamental underlying genetic reproductive fitness becomes. The society becomes biologically, structurally locked into a low fertility state.
Which means we are at a point of no return. We can't just elect a new politician, flip a policy switch, and go back to the booming demographics of the 1950s, even if we desperately wanted to. The physical biology won't support it, the chemical environment won't support it, and the economic culture won't support it.
Exactly. We're past that point.
So if we accept the hard reality that we cannot reverse this trend, we have to completely change our relationship to it. We have to stop trying to cure the condition and start trying to survive it. This brings me to a highly specific location that I think holds the key. Imagine a gritty, highly functional, deeply unglamorous manufacturing town in Germany's industrial heartland. This is where I encountered a scenario that completely strips away the existential panic surrounding the population crisis. I want you to meet Klaus. He is a 61-year-old shop floor manager in a mid-sized auto parts factory. Klaus's physical reality is defined by his failing knees and the deep, muscular memory of the heavy lifting that used to systematically destroy factory workers' backs by the time they reached age 50. Now, however, he spends his mornings not lifting steel, but carefully calibrating a new collaborative robot, or cobot, a massive articulated arm that works alongside him, doing the heavy lifting he no longer can. And working alongside both Klaus and the cobot is Arash, a 24-year-old software engineer who arrived in Germany from Tehran 3 years ago. When you stand on that factory floor and watch them interact, there is a palpable, almost awkward cultural friction between Klaus's gruff, seasoned local traditionalism and Arash's frantic, eager, highly educated energy. But beneath that surface, friction is a profound, absolutely necessary bond. This is not a scenario you find in a glossy, sanitized corporate brochure about the virtues of diversity and inclusion. It is a raw, unvarnished, high-stakes survival strategy. Klaus recognizes with complete, unsentimental clarity that the cobot doing the lifting and the young migrant programming it are the only structural reasons his town still has a functioning tax base, an open school, and a stocked grocery store. Klaus and Arash aren't trying to reverse the demographic shifts of the 21st century. They're simply building a highly functional, resilient way to live within them.
That vignette perfectly encapsulates the massive paradigm shift that must occur at the highest levels of government. For decades, policymakers and economists have treated the aging population as a terminal civilizational disease that requires a desperate demographic cure, namely, a massive, impossible influx of new births.
Right, which isn't happening.
Klaus demonstrates the alternative. We must instead view an aging population as a structural, permanent, unchangeable reality that requires rigorous mechanical and social adaptation. The demographic transition is not a glitch. It is a permanent feature of the human landscape, and our survival entirely depends on how we manage the aftermath.
So let's unpack the mechanics of Klaus's survival strategy, starting with the first pillar, Arash, immigration. It offers a crucial immediate offset for wealthy nations facing a rapidly shrinking aging workforce. It provides immediate labor, it instantly expands the tax base to pay for pensions, and it brings in younger demographics to revitalize dying towns. But we have to be honest about the long-term global mechanics here. Why is immigration as a standalone policy not the permanent global solution that some economists desperately hope it to be?
Well, while immigration is a vital, non-negotiable, short to medium-term adaptive mechanism, its long-term mathematical efficacy is severely constrained by three major structural realities.
Okay.
First, we must acknowledge political resistance. As we're seeing globally across Europe and North America, rapid demographic shifts driven by high levels of concentrated immigration often trigger intense political, cultural, and social friction in receiving nations, inevitably leading to highly restrictive policies and closed borders.
Yeah.
Second, the demographic advantage of importing youth is surprisingly temporary. The higher fertility rates that immigrants often bring from their home countries assimilate remarkably quickly to their new environment. By the second or third generation, their birth rates typically converge entirely with the lower sub-replacement birth rates of the host nation's native population. They enter the same biological pressure cooker you mentioned earlier. You're merely importing a temporary demographic bulge, a short-term band-aid, not a permanent change in human reproductive behavior. Third, and perhaps most critically for the global outlook, the pool of potential migrants is rapidly shrinking. The fertility decline is no longer a Western phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. Sender nations across Latin America, across Asia, and increasingly across sub-Saharan Africa are experiencing their own steep, accelerated demographic transitions. The world is simply running out of surplus young populations to export.
Which means Klaus's other partner on that factory floor, the cobot, becomes infinitely more critical to our survival. We have to look at how automation, capital, artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, machine learning algorithms actually interfaces with a shrinking, aging workforce. And this is where the macroeconomic modeling gets truly fascinating. How do economists actually predict this? How do things like dynamic stochastic general equilibrium or DSGE models project the incredibly complex interaction between these massive forces?
I want you to think of a DSGE model like a giant, incredibly complex game of SimCity running on a supercomputer. Okay. It doesn't just look at what one factory does in isolation. It attempts to map the massive butterfly effect of technological change. It looks at how introducing a new robot into a factory affects that specific worker's wages, which subsequently affects how much groceries they buy, which alters the local tax revenue, which determines if the government can build a new hospital. It simulates how different economic agents, households, firms, and governments dynamically react to structural shocks over time. When we use these DSGE models to simulate the introduction of advanced automation capital into a rapidly shrinking labor market, the results reveal a highly complex, often paradoxical feedback loop. On a macro level, the model shows that automation vastly expands the overall productive capacity of the economy. It highly complements highly skilled labor, allowing a much smaller, highly educated workforce to maintain or even massively increase total GDP. However, the models also reveal a dark side. Automation can systematically, relentlessly suppress wages at the lower end of the skill spectrum as machines replace routine manual tasks.
And that wage suppression directly impacts the first pillar we discussed. It directly impacts immigration.
The primary overriding driver of economic migration is the wage premium. The massive financial advantage a worker gains by leaving their home and moving from a low-income country to a high-income country. If automation systematically suppresses wages in the exact specific sectors that typically absorb new migrant labor sectors like manufacturing, logistics, warehousing, and basic services, it significantly reduces that wage premium. The financial incentive for a worker to migrate diminishes.
Incredible.
Therefore, the SimCity simulation of the DSGE models demonstrates that automation and migration do not operate independently in a vacuum. They dynamically interact and, in many complex scenarios, actively counteract each other. As a society aggressively automates to survive a severe labor shortage, it simultaneously reduces its ability to attract the migrant labor that was the alternative solution to that exact same shortage.
This necessitates a completely new way of looking at the workforce we already possess within our borders. If we can't breed our way out, and we can't migrate our way out, and automation has limits, we have to look at Klaus. We need to introduce a critical, revolutionary, new demographic concept that redefines what it fundamentally means to grow old. Historically, we have defined old age strictly, rigidly, chronologically. This is known as retrospective aging. You simply count the years since birth, and once someone hits the arbitrary number of 65, they cross a rigid statistical line from productive worker to economic dependent. But that model is entirely obsolete, isn't it?
It is entirely obsolete because it fundamentally fails to account for a century of monumental human progress. Demographers like Sanderson and Sherboff have pioneered a much more accurate, highly functional metric: prospective aging. Instead of looking backward at the number of years lived, prospective aging defines old age by looking forward. It calculates remaining life expectancy and functional physical capacity. Because of monumental historic advances in healthcare, nutrition, sanitation, and workplace safety, a 65-year-old today has significantly greater functional capacity, cognitive sharpness, and a much longer remaining life expectancy than a 65-year-old in 1950. The colloquial phrase, 70 is the new 60, isn't just an optimistic marketing slogan for retirement communities. It is a hard, measurable statistical reality.
And the economic projections based on this forward-looking prospective model are staggering. If we redefine our societal expectations, if functional capacity continues to steadily improve due to medical technology, and if we restructure rigid labor markets to allow older populations to remain in the workforce on their own terms, perhaps in less physically demanding, more consultative, knowledge-based roles, it radically alters the entire economic outlook of the globe. The economic projections show that this functional adaptation can cushion up to half of the entire demographic drag on GDP growth caused by the shrinking youth cohort. Half of the impending economic crisis simply vanishes if we update our definition of aging and utilize the people we have.
But achieving that requires a holistic, massive shift in how society is fundamentally organized. It demands aggressive lifelong learning initiatives, highly flexible working arrangements, and healthcare systems completely focused on extending functional health span, not just blindly extending lifespan. The massive demographic dividend of the 20th century was driven by a massive influx of young, cheap workers. The longevity dividend of the 21st century must be driven by maximizing the functional capacity and deep experience of an older, healthier population.
The global decline in birth rates is not a symptom of civilizational decay, but the direct reflection of immense human progress. The eradication of mass child mortality, the liberation and education of women, and the transition from agrarian survival to urban modernity.
The structural forces driving peak people, massive opportunity costs, functional aging, and deep underlying biological shifts are permanent, unyielding features of the modern landscape.
The real danger lies not in the fact that populations are choosing to have fewer children, but in the stubborn refusal of political and economic systems to adjust to the inevitable consequences of that choice.